They crossed the border chasing waves, freedom, and a few perfect days by the sea. Three friends, one truck, a quiet stretch of Baja coastline that felt untouched by the world. But in the middle of the night, a stranger stepped into their camp, asking questions, taking mental notes, and unknowingly sounding their death sentence. This isn't a story about surfing. It's about the moment trust becomes a weapon and how three lives vanished into the silence of Baja. They vanish without warning. Lives are shattered, yet the world moves on as if nothing happened. Some stories refuse to fade, echoing long after the headlines disappear. In Season 2, we dig deeper, uncovering the hidden truths behind the whispers of the taken. They had talked about it for months: the escape, the waves, the open road. For Jake Robinson, Callum Robinson, and Jack Carter Rhoad, the journey south into Baja California was supposed to be simple: surf, camp, and disappear for a while from the noise of everyday life. No schedules, no deadlines, just salt in the air and sand beneath their feet. They crossed into Mexico with boards strapped to the truck, laughter filling the cab, and the kind of optimism that only comes from youth and shared freedom. Baja had always been a place surfers whispered about with reverence: uncrowded breaks, rugged coastline, and a sense that time moves slower there. To them, it felt untouched, almost sacred. As they drove farther south of Ensenada, the landscape changed. The city noise faded, replaced by long stretches of dirt road, cactus silhouettes, and the endless Pacific to their right. They chose a remote campsite near Punta San Jose, a place known more to locals and seasoned surfers than to tourists. It was quiet, isolated, perfect. That night, they cooked over a small fire, drank beers, and planned the next day's surf. They joked about who wiped out hardest, who caught the cleanest wave. There was no fear in their voices, only the easy confidence of men who believed they were exactly where they were meant to be. They did not know that isolation, the very thing that made the trip special, was also what made them vulnerable. A stranger at the fire. It was late when she appeared, a lone figure approaching their camp from the darkness. Ari Giselle Silva Raya did not look threatening. She was calm, conversational, almost friendly. She asked questions. Where were they from? How long were they staying? Was the truck theirs? The surfers were polite. They had traveled enough to know that friendliness could be currency in unfamiliar places. Silva lingered longer than expected, her attention drifting repeatedly toward the truck, the gear, the phones. She commented on the value of the vehicle, casually as if making small talk. To the men, it felt slightly strange, but not dangerous. People passed through camps all the time in Baja. Some asked for food, others for conversation. Eventually, Silva left, disappearing back into the dark. What the surfers could not know was that the conversation was not harmless. To Silva, this was not curiosity, it was reconnaissance. While she spoke calmly by the fire, she was already deciding their fate, the warning they never heard. Later, investigators would say that Silva contacted her boyfriend and others after leaving the campsite. She told them about the truck, the equipment, the opportunity. She warned them the men were foreign, isolated, and alone. In a grim irony, Silva's presence that night was a warning, not to the surfers, but about them, a signal sent into the darkness that marked them as targets. Back at the camp, Jake, Callum, and Jack went to sleep, believing the night was over. The waves would be good in the morning. The fire burned low. The ocean moved as it always had. They never heard the truck return. The attack. Sometime during the night, the quiet returned, but not the peace. The people who had visited the camp earlier came back under the cover of darkness. What followed was not planned chaos, but a situation that unraveled quickly. What was meant to be a robbery spiraled beyond control, crossing a line that could never be undone. The stillness of the coastline was broken. The fire that had once signaled warmth and safety burned out, replaced by fear and confusion. Within minutes, the lives of three men were cut short, not by fate or accident, but by a choice made in the dark. If you're enjoying the video so far, please take a second to like and subscribe. It's a huge help to the channel. Thank you. Now back to the story. But the violence did not end there. In the hours that followed, deliberate steps were taken to erase what had happened. The attackers moved the bodies away from the campsite, transporting them to a remote, abandoned well hidden deep within the rugged terrain. It was a place chosen not at random, but for its isolation, a place meant to conceal rather than reveal. The truck was taken. The gear disappeared. Any trace of the men's presence was stripped away, as though they had never been there at all. By morning, the campsite stood empty. The ocean continued its rhythm, waves breaking as they always had. But the laughter, the plans, and the promise of the trip were gone, replaced by a silence that would soon demand answers. The search. When the men failed to check in with family, concern turned to panic. Search efforts began on both sides of the border. Social media lit up with missing posters and pleas for information. Volunteers scoured the rugged terrain. Days later, the truth emerged. The well was discovered. Inside were the bodies of Jake Robinson, Callum Robinson, and Jack Carter Rhoad, each killed by gunshot wounds to the head. The manner of death was swift, but the disposal spoke of calculation and cruelty. News of the discovery spread rapidly across Australia, the United States, and Mexico. What had begun as a surfing trip had become an international tragedy. The investigation authorities moved quickly. Evidence led back to Silva Raya and 3 male accomplices. Prosecutors alleged that Silva's initial encounter with the surfers was intentional, a setup rather than a coincidence. The narrative became clear. This was not cartel violence or mistaken identity. It was opportunistic robbery fueled by desperation and greed, ending in murder. For many observers, that made the crime even more unsettling. There was no grand conspiracy, no larger war, just a moment where human life was weighed against material value and found expendable. Justice in pieces. Silva Raya later pleaded guilty to robbery with violence and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Her accomplices faced the possibility of far longer sentences if convicted. On paper, the legal process moved forward. Charges filed, verdicts reached, consequences imposed. But for the families left behind, the courtroom outcomes offered little comfort. No sentence could account for the futures erased, the calls that would never be returned, or the milestones that would now pass in silence. Years behind bars could not translate into answers that mattered most. Why or how this was allowed to happen. Justice in cases like this arrives in pieces. It punishes wrongdoing. It acknowledges guilt. But it cannot restore what was taken, and it cannot mend the absence left behind. What remains is accountability, and the quiet understanding that some losses sit forever beyond the reach of the law. The human cost. Jake Robinson, Callum Robinson, Jack Carter Rhoad. 3 names that became headlines. But long before that, they were lives in motion. They were sons who called home, brothers who shared inside jokes and old memories, friends who showed up, who laughed easily, who planned for futures that felt wide open. They were surfers not because they were reckless, but because they loved the rhythm of the ocean, the calm that came from moving with something larger than themselves. Those who knew them spoke of warmth, curiosity, and humor, of young men who made people feel comfortable, who carried optimism without arrogance, who believed the world was something to explore, not fear. Their lives were not defined by risk, but by connection, to each other, to family, and to the simple joy of shared experience. Their deaths left more than grief. They left a silence that traveled across borders and oceans, settling into homes in Australia and the United States. Birthdays passed. Messages went unanswered. Futures that once felt certain suddenly stopped. The well where they were found became more than a crime scene. It became a symbol of how quickly laughter can vanish, of how trust can be exploited, and of how a moment meant for freedom can collapse into loss. A place where joy ended, and where the weight of what was taken became impossible to ignore. They went south seeking waves and memories. What they left behind was a void, one that will never fully close. Baja and the illusion of safety. Baja California remains a place of beauty and contradiction. Millions visit safely every year. Yet cases like this expose the fragile line between adventure and vulnerability, especially in remote areas where help is far away. The tragedy sparked renewed conversations about travel safety, isolation, and the assumptions tourists often carry with them, that danger belongs elsewhere, to someone else. The silence after the waves. The ocean does not remember them. Waves rise, break, and disappear as they always have. But people remember. The Baja surfer murders are not just a crime story. They are a reminder of trust misplaced, of warnings unheard, and of how ordinary moments can cross an invisible line and never return. 3 men went south chasing waves. Only silence came back. And in that silence are the whispers of the taken. Thank you for staying with us until the end. These stories deserve to be remembered and told with care. If this episode moved you, please consider hitting like and subscribing. It's a small action that helps keep these voices from fading into silence. Until next time, listen closely. The whispers are never truly gone.